Hello and welcome to my review of Inside Number 9, Series 9, Episode 2. This week we're looking at The Trolley Problem, in which a psychotherapist named Blake, played by Steve Pemberton, takes in a troubled stranger named Drew, played by Reece Shearsmith. Over a nice cup of tea, the two engage in some discussions about different approaches to therapy and hypothetical dilemmas that are designed to gain some insight into a person's character. But before we start, can we just take a moment to appreciate this, which was sent to me by my sister just after the episode finished. This image comes courtesy of the League of Psychos Inside Number 9 Facebook group, who are well worth checking out for more Number 9, League of Gentlemen and Psychoville goodness. And now I want to watch a full remake of Baby Reindeer starring Herr Lipp and Justin, my very own Justin, which would only be slightly less distressing than the original, I imagine. Because that was an experience. Anyway, this week's episode, The Trolley Problem, is largely a two-hander, which is always good because these two play off each other so well. And by this point in their careers and working relationship, how could they not? It's quite a contrast after last week's ensemble cast in Boo to a Goose, although I found it an odd coincidence that the last episode got me thinking about the bystander effect, which is directly referenced in this episode. Did anyone else think that, or was it just me? So the acting, and I think we're almost taking it for granted at this point, is top tier. Just imagine you're seeing these two performing together for the very first time and you'll appreciate it all the more. Likewise, the premise and themes of this episode are very interesting, especially if you have an interest in psychology and psychotherapy. The titular trolley problem is discussed at length, of course, along with examples of the variations which I think are what makes this scenario more interesting. Because personally, I'm not a huge fan of hypotheticals with a binary outcome. I tend to bombard the questioner with extra questions until they're tearing their hair out, and gun to my head, I would probably end up getting shot. The bare bones trolley problem of whether or not a person would intervene and sacrifice one person for the sake of sparing 5 is not without criticism, and it's argued that the scenario is too detached from real life morality to actually be useful. Thankfully, the dialogue here helps to expand on the trolley scenario, bringing up a third option of throwing oneself in front of the trolley to save everyone else, which I think more people would like to think they would do than actually would. And of course, what do you do if Greg Wallace or Mary Berry are standing on the tracks? I'll come back to this part in the spoiler section, but if you're interested in experimenting with fleshed out variations of the trolley problem, there's a Cyanide and Happiness card game called Trial by Trolley that I've heard is pretty good, and I did once see the trolley problem adapted to explain why, philosophically speaking, Batman doesn't just kill the Joker. So it can be a very versatile concept, depending on your approach. But back to the episode, and I was happy to see how other elements of psychotherapy were handled, along with Blake and his deliberately obscured McCambridge degree. Incidentally, I looked up McCambridge to see if it's a thing, and the top result was the actress Mercedes McCambridge, who provided the demonic voice in The Exorcist. Anyway, back on track. It makes sense that a character like Blake is happy to explain aspects of his work to anyone who'll listen, otherwise the dialogue might have come across as clunky and unnatural, but I think they get away with it here. I also liked how some of the exercises are explained, with some having been debunked or discredited, and others I'd never even heard of before, such as the laughing yoga thing, which genuinely did end up with me laughing out loud by myself at home like a madwoman. But maybe that's just because Steve Pemberton is such a funny guy, he can't help but crack me up. So is this a good episode? Yes, absolutely. It's got some fine acting, incredibly tense moments, and a very memorable ending. Hats off to Al Campbell, aka Barry Shitpeas, for that final sequence. Also brilliant, and I don't want to spoil too many things right now, were the voice acting contributions in this episode. I have a lot of respect for that line of work. But is The Trolley Problem one of the all-time greats? That I'm not so sure of, as I'll soon be getting into some other nines that this one reminded me of that were arguably better written. Also, for those who haven't seen it yet, this episode touches on a number of potentially distressing themes. I know that's the case with many a Number 9, but in this case, these subjects are a bit more grounded in reality, so if you're dealing with some personal trauma, you might want to learn more about it before watching, or maybe give this one a miss and come back next week. I'll list those subjects in just a moment before I start giving out plot spoilers. So if you're leaving us here, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week at Mulberry Close, which looks like it's going to be a really good one. Till then, stay safe, watch out for runaway trolleys, and have a great weekend. Okay, so some of the topics looked at in this episode include mental health issues, suicide, self-harm, and the abuse of a vulnerable young person by a professional who they should have been able to trust. This can be quite harrowing to listen to, even if it hasn't affected your life, but I saw a few people asking about the content of this episode on Twitter, so I thought I'd give out some more details just before the spoilers. I always like to give a heads up wherever I can. So with that said, here come the spoilers. Overall, I enjoy a good number 9 twisted revenge story, and I liked where they went with this one. However, I can't help but compare it to some other episodes, such as The Riddle of the Sphinx, Can We Ever Trust Steve Pemberton with a Cup of Tea? Or Misdirection, where we had another unorthodox revenge plot that didn't directly target the person they wanted to hurt. Or The Last Weekend, which was only 2 episodes ago and still one of the most creative forms of homicide they've ever depicted. So how does the Trolley Problem measure up to those? Let's look at the positives. Targeting Blake's son and having him talk to his father while he's buried alive was wonderfully twisted. Having Drew, if that is his real name, I have my doubts, set himself on fire when he's the only one who knows where Robbie's location was, that was equally twisted and shocking in that final shot. Tying this, sort of, to the earlier Trolley Problem, where an act of self-sacrifice could have saved people on both tracks, was clever and not really overstated either. So even though it's another bizarre revenge plot episode, it's still unique, and I think it still works. However, I'm sorry, but I don't think it quite holds up to the standards of those other episodes I've mentioned, and I think that boils down to the plot and setting. This time, we don't have anything quite as visually interesting as the Professor's office with the big cryptic crossword, or the Magician's warehouse complete with working guillotine. Even The Last Weekend, which also had a remote countryside setting, managed to use this to subvert the mood and narrative, where the peaceful, idyllic backdrop suddenly flipped into a living nightmare where you're at nature's mercy and no one can hear you scream. And I didn't quite get anything as exciting from this number 9. As for the revenge plot, well, it kind of felt like it needed another going over, as so many of the working parts were wholly dependent on Blake's actions. For instance, and I've seen some other people say this too, I have no idea why he agreed to go back inside and get Drew's coat, but that needed to happen in order for the ending to work. Also, small point, but why is the number unknown if Blake already called the mobile? Plus, the entire plot hinged on Drew being picked up by Blake, driven to Blake's home and not, say, a hospital or a police station, then on Drew getting the opportunity to slip drugs into Blake's drink. Oh, and on Drew finding enough spare petrol to douse himself in. I'm sure he didn't have that in his pocket. He might have studied Blake's behaviour, but any number of variables could have happened, and then Drew would be left with a teenager stuck down a hole for nothing. Okay, maybe I'm being a bit too hard on the plot here, as Riddle of the Sphinx and Misdirection were also quite far-fetched. But in those episodes there were so many twists, turns and revelations all the way through that they just kept dazzling you, getting you hooked on what was happening and well aware of the stakes. Plus, I think those plots were just written a lot tighter with barely an ounce of fat or a superfluous detail in sight. Maybe it's a good sign for the show when the worst thing you can say about an episode is that this one might not be a masterpiece. But now for some more positives. That taped conversation between Blake and Ellie was gripping in the most bone-chilling way imaginable. You didn't want to keep listening, but you were hanging on their every word. I thought it was horrifying. We're hearing a young, vulnerable person who's sharing their darkest secrets and is desperate for professional help, and he's taking advantage of her. Just opening up about those things that Ellie does is terrifying. There's that underlying fear that you'll be labelled a time waster or an attention seeker, or simply that the person that you're talking to, professional or not, might not believe you or be willing to help. If you've ever experienced that fear, then I am so sorry for what you've been through, and I really hope that the person you confided in was kind to you. You did a brave thing, and you deserve to be listened to. Just imagining somebody taking advantage of that situation is disgusting, and hearing Blake asking to touch Ellie's scars was truly awful. After that, if Drew had set Blake on fire, then I'd have thought, fair enough. Also, I thought this plot point was well seeded, as we'd already had a few hints about Blake and his deceptive and controlling nature. We just didn't know the extent of it. The way he hides part of his certificate so that it looks more reputable, the way he thinks it's acceptable to slip a sedative into a stranger's tea to calm him down, even though he knows nothing of the guy's medical history. That's irresponsible to say the least, even if he knows he's got that gun. Plus, I'm not even sure that he'd be able to dole out medicines like that without a proper medical licence or a degree that didn't come from McDonald's. But of course, Blake is more than happy to babble on about being a successful therapist, mixing outdated methods and quackery into the mix if it sounds more colourful or makes him look more intelligent. We've got the measure of you, Blake, and the prognosis is not good. But here's the thing. Will Blake's actions within the episode feel somewhat connected to the trolley problem, in that he talks about throwing himself in front of the trolley by recording his confession but then fails to do so and multiple people die? But I'm not so sure that the past situation with Ellie in the hotel fits the mould quite as well. Sure, we got the inaction part where Blake didn't call for medical intervention, but isn't the idea that taking action means there's going to be some other form of casualty? I mean, if it's the choice between the trolley hitting people or switching it to an empty track, then that's hardly a dilemma. If we were talking about Blake's own reputation and profession on the line, well, he was still clocked coming out of the hotel and violating the restraining order either way, so what difference does it make if he puts in an anonymous call? Except, of course, that Ellie survives. Surely that's better than the alternative, unless, of course, he wanted her dead. Plus, Blake didn't just happen upon a runaway trolley, a switch, and some innocent bystanders, but rather an ongoing situation for which he himself was responsible. It reminded me of a certain plot point in BoJack Horseman, and if you've seen that, then you'd know what I'm talking about. Again, that might not be a fair comparison, but that's what I was thinking about. But I don't know, maybe I'm missing something here. What do you think? Am I being unfair in this episode, which, I'll stress once again, I still really enjoyed? Oh, and in case you were wondering what Reece's drawing looked like, Steve tweeted this on the night after the episode. So there you go. Well, if we've all learned one thing, it's to never mess with Steve or Reece's kids, because their vengeance will be long drawn out, convoluted, weird, and extremely violent. But anyways, thanks for listening. Please share your own thoughts about the trolley problem in the comments, and remember to like and subscribe for more Inside Number 9 opinions and commentary. That and ring the bell so you can hear the next review right away. See you next week.